If you enjoy my stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me which city you're from and what time it is there. I'm curious to know where my favorite subscribers are from, and share the scariest story that ever happened to you. I'll pin the best one under the video forever. My name is Mike Patterson, and I need to tell you about what happened on Highway 285, somewhere between Pecos and Fort Stockton, Texas, on a night that still haunts my dreams. I've been driving long haul for 15 years, seen every mile of interstate from Maine to California, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered at that godforsaken gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was late July, and the heat was the kind that doesn't quit, even after the sun goes down. The asphalt was still radiating warmth at 11 p.m., creating those shimmering mirages that make the road look like it's breathing. I'd been driving since dawn, hauling a load of electronics from Houston to Phoenix, and my eyes were starting to burn from staring at the endless ribbon of highway cutting through the Texas desert. The Lone Star Travel Plaza appeared out of the darkness like an oasis, its neon signs buzzing and flickering against the black sky. It was one of those isolated truck stops that dot the emptier stretches of highway, the kind that exists purely out of necessity, serving the handful of drivers crazy enough to push through the night instead of pulling over for mandatory rest. 2 gas pumps under harsh fluorescent lights, a small convenience store attached to what passed for a diner, and a parking area big enough for maybe a dozen vehicles. I pulled my rig into the lot, the air brakes hissing as I came to a stop. The sound echoed across the empty desert, and for a moment, everything was silent, except for the distant hum of cicadas and the electrical buzz from the overhead lights. That's when I first noticed the car. It was parked at the far edge of the lot, just outside the reach of the fluorescent glow. An old sedan, maybe mid-70s, the kind of car that had probably been beautiful once, but now looked like it had been baking in the Texas sun for decades. The paint was faded to an indeterminate color that might have been blue or green or gray, and the chrome bumpers were pitted with rust. The windows were tinted darker than seemed legal, but there was something about the way they caught the light that made them look almost fogged, like they were steamed up from the inside. But what caught my attention wasn't the car itself. It was the figure sitting behind the wheel. Even from 30 yards away, I could see the silhouette clearly. A man, hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, head facing straight ahead toward the empty highway. He wasn't moving, not even slightly, just sitting there in perfect stillness like a mannequin positioned for display. I shrugged it off. A lot of weird people out here in the middle of nowhere, druggies sleeping it off, drifters with nowhere else to go, truckers taking unauthorized breaks. Hell, maybe the guy was just enjoying the night air, taking a moment to appreciate the kind of silence you can only find in the deep desert. The convenience store was a typical highway affair, fluorescent lights that hummed too loud, shelves stocked with overpriced snacks and motor oil, a rotating rack of trucker caps and novelty t-shirts. Behind the counter sat a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, earbuds in, nodding along to whatever music was playing on his phone. He looked up when I entered, pulling out one earbud with obvious reluctance. "Evening," I said, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler and a bag of beef jerky from the rack. Pretty quiet night. Yeah, always is out here. His accent was pure Texas, all drawn-out vowels and lazy consonants. Just the regulars passing through, you heading west? Phoenix, long haul. I set my purchases on the counter and pulled out my wallet. That car out there been here long? The kid glanced through the window, squinting into the darkness. Which car? The old sedan. Guy sitting in it, hands on the wheel. He looked again, longer this time, then shrugged. Couple hours, maybe. Hasn't moved since I started my shift. Probably just sleeping it off, you know. We get that sometimes. I paid for my items and headed back outside. The night air hit me like opening an oven door. Still had to be over 90 degrees with humidity that made everything feel sticky and oppressive. The cicadas were louder now, their rhythmic chirping creating a wall of sound that seemed to press in from all directions. The old sedan was still there, unchanged. Same position, same stillness. I found myself staring at it as I walked back to my truck, trying to make out more details in the dim light. The figure behind the wheel hadn't moved so much as an inch. Even his head was in exactly the same position, facing straight ahead, like he was watching something on the horizon that only he could see. I climbed into my cab and settled in for what I'd planned to be a quick rest stop. Just enough time to grab some food, maybe catch a few minutes of sleep before pushing on through the night. But something about that car was bothering me, gnawing at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite dig out. The diner was attached to the convenience store, one of those places that probably hadn't changed its decor since the Carter administration. Red vinyl booths, a counter with chrome stools, and a menu that featured exactly what you'd expect. Chicken fried steak, burgers, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The waitress was maybe 50, with bleached hair and tired eyes, but she had that particular brand of Texas friendliness that made you feel welcome, even at midnight. "What can I get you, honey?" she asked, as I slid into a booth near the window. "Coffee and a burger, medium rare, and maybe some answers about that car out there." She followed my gaze through the window, her expression shifting slightly. "Oh, that old thing. Been sitting there since around 9, I think. Haven't seen anyone get out of it." "You think maybe someone should check on the driver? Make sure he's okay?" She considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "Happens more than you'd think out here. People pull over to sleep. Sometimes they're out for hours, as long as they're not causing trouble." She shrugged. "Live and let live, you know." The burger was better than I'd expected, and the coffee was exactly as advertised. Strong enough to strip paint, I ate slowly, partly because I was genuinely hungry, and partly because I kept finding my attention drawn to that window, to the parking lot beyond, to the old sedan that hadn't moved an inch in the hour I'd been watching it. It was just after midnight when I finally paid my check and headed back outside. The temperature had dropped maybe 5 degrees, but the air was still thick and oppressive. The neon signs buzzed and flickered, casting shifting patterns of colored light across the empty asphalt. The sedan was still there, same position, same stillness, but now I was close enough to see something that made my skin crawl. The interior light was on. It was dim, barely more than a glow, but it illuminated the figure behind the wheel clearly enough for me to make out details. The man, and it was definitely a man, was wearing what looked like a dark suit or jacket. His hair was neat, combed back in a style that seemed decades out of date. His hands were positioned precisely on the steering wheel, fingers curved, as if he was actively driving, but the car wasn't running. I could tell because there was no exhaust, no vibration, no sound at all. And his face, Jesus Christ, his face, it was pale. Not just pale, white. White as paper, white as bone, white as something that had never seen sunlight. His features were sharp and regular, almost handsome in a classical way. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The jaw was too square, the cheekbones too pronounced, the forehead too high. It was like looking at a photograph that had been subtly distorted, just enough to fall into the uncanny valley where things that should be human become deeply unsettling. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Even from 20 feet away, I could see that they were pale too, not blue or gray, but actually colorless like glass marbles. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared with the fixed intensity of a statue, but it was his mouth that really got to me. It was closed, lips pressed together in a thin line. But there was something about the shape of it that suggested it could open much wider than any human mouth should, the corners turned up slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough to be deeply unnerving. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just watching, waiting for some sign of movement, some indication that this was just a guy taking a break who happened to have really pale skin and an unfortunate resting face. But nothing changed. He might as well have been carved from marble. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the car. Each step felt like it took enormous effort, as if I was walking through thick mud or fighting against a strong wind. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The night sounds, the cicadas, the distant hum of traffic on the highway, even the buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade away, replaced by a silence so complete it made my ears ring. At 10 feet away, I could see him clearly. The pale skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, like thin plastic stretched over something that wasn't quite the right shape. I could see the suggestion of veins underneath, but they were the wrong color, too dark, and they formed patterns that didn't match human anatomy. At 5 feet, I realized he was looking at me. His head hadn't moved, his eyes hadn't shifted, but somehow, impossibly, I could feel his attention focused on me, like the beam of a searchlight. Those colorless eyes were no longer staring at the highway. They were staring at me, through me, into me. And then his mouth began to open. It started slowly, just a slight parting of the lips. But it kept going, opening wider and wider, stretching far beyond what should have been physically possible. The corners of his mouth pulled back toward his ears, revealing row after row of teeth that were all wrong. They were sharp, yes, but more than that, they were chaotic. Different sizes, different angles, overlapping and intersecting, like they'd been jammed into his mouth by someone who didn't understand how teeth were supposed to work. And behind the teeth, nothing, just darkness. Not the darkness of a throat or the back of a mouth, but absolute void, like I was looking into deep space. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The rational part of my brain was screaming explanations. Trick of the light, optical illusion, fatigue-induced hallucination. But the primitive part, the part that had kept my ancestors alive in caves and forests, was screaming something else, entirely. Run! I turned and sprinted back toward the store, my boots slapping against the asphalt. Behind me, I heard something. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the air pressure. Like the moment before thunder, I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I burst through the convenience store door so hard the bell nearly flew off its mount. The kid behind the counter looked up, startled, pulling out both earbuds this time. "Hey man, you okay? You look like you've seen a..." "Call the police," I gasped, leaning against the counter to catch my breath. "There's something wrong with that guy in the car. Something really wrong." The kid looked confused. "What guy?" "The guy in the sedan. Old car, been sitting there for hours. Go look." He came around the counter reluctantly. Moving to the window, I followed, my hands still shaking. Together, we peered out at the parking lot. The car was empty. Not just empty. It looked like it had been empty for years. The interior light was off, and through the clear windows, I could see that the seats were covered in dust and debris. The dashboard was cracked and faded, and there were cobwebs in the corners of the windshield. "I don't see anybody," the kid said, looking at me with growing concern. "You sure you're feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down, get some water." I stared at the car, my mind reeling, but he was there. I saw him. I was standing right next to the car, and he was sitting behind the wheel, and his mouth... I trailed off, realizing how insane I sounded. "Look, maybe you should take a break," the kid said gently. "It's been a long night, and sometimes the heat can mess with your head. Why don't you grab a cold drink, maybe splash some water on your face?" I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I'd seen what I'd seen, but the evidence was right there in front of me. Empty car, dust-covered interior, no sign that anyone had been inside it for months, maybe years. I bought another bottle of water and went back to my truck, my head spinning. Fatigue, heat, exhaustion, dehydration, all perfectly reasonable explanations for what I'd experienced. I'd been driving for too long, pushing too hard, and my brain had finally decided to play tricks on me. But as I climbed into my cab, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror that made my blood freeze. The car wasn't empty anymore. He was back. Same position, same pose, same pale face staring straight ahead. The interior light was on again, casting that sickly glow over his motionless form, and as I watched, frozen in terror, his head began to turn toward me with mechanical precision. Those colorless eyes found mine in the mirror. His mouth began to stretch open again, revealing that impossible cavern of chaos and darkness. And this time, I heard something. Not a voice exactly, but a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight into my brain. "Get in." I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, spraying gravel as I peeled out of the parking lot and onto the highway. In my mirrors, I could see the gas station shrinking rapidly behind me, the neon signs fading into the distance. But I could also see something else, a single headlight, following at a distance that never seemed to change, no matter how fast I drove. I pushed the speedometer up to 80, then 90. The old truck was shaking, straining against the demands I was placing on it. But that headlight stayed exactly the same distance behind me. Not gaining, not falling back, just there, following with mechanical precision. After 20 miles, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over at the next exit, a small town called Grand Falls that consisted of little more than a truck stop. and a few scattered buildings, I parked under the bright lights of the fuel islands and climbed out, checking every direction for any sign of the old sedan. Nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, just the occasional pair of headlights in the distance, belonging to legitimate travelers going about their business. I was losing my mind. Had to be. The stress of the job, the isolation, the endless miles of empty road, it was finally getting to me, the way it got to a lot of drivers. Eventually, road madness, they called it. The point where your brain starts seeing things that aren't there, creating patterns and threats out of shadows. And coincidence, I went inside the truck stop, bought more coffee, and sat in a booth by the window where I could watch my rig and the surrounding area. The place was busy, unusual for this time of night, but comforting normal people doing normal things. A family with kids asleep in the back seat, filling up their minivan. A couple of other truckers grabbing showers and hot meals. An elderly man walking a small dog around the parking lot. Everything was perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal. The kind of scene that proved the world was still functioning according to rational rules. I was starting to relax when I saw the car. It was parked at the far end of the lot, just outside the reach of the overhead lights. Same make and model as before, but this time it was a different color, dark red instead of the faded blue-gray I'd seen at the first station. But the figure behind the wheel was unmistakable. Same position, same stillness, same pale face staring straight ahead, and he was looking directly at me. I could feel his attention like a weight pressing down on my chest. Those colorless eyes seemed to penetrate right through the windows of the truck stop, through the walls, through everything, until they found me sitting in my booth, clutching a cup of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The family with the minivan walked right past the car without giving it a second glance. The truckers, the elderly man with the dog, none of them seemed to notice it at all. They went about their business as if the car didn't exist, as if the figure inside it was invisible to everyone but me. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my coffee, to breathe normally. When I looked back 5 minutes later, the car was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I stayed at that truck stop for 2 hours, nursing coffee and trying to convince myself that I was suffering from some kind of breakdown, stress-induced psychosis, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in my exhaust system. Anything that would explain what I was seeing without requiring me to accept that something impossible was happening. When I finally worked up the courage to get back on the road, I drove slowly, carefully, checking my mirrors constantly. The highway was empty except for the occasional 18-wheeler heading in the opposite direction, their headlights blazing past in a brief moment of noise and light before disappearing into the darkness behind me. I made it 50 miles before I saw the headlight again. It appeared suddenly in my passenger side mirror, as if it had materialized out of the desert itself, just one light, dim and yellowish, maintaining that same impossible distance, no matter how my speed fluctuated. I slowed down to 60, it stayed back. I sped up to 90. It kept pace perfectly. But this time was different. This time I could make out more details as the miles passed. It wasn't just one headlight. It was two, but one was burned out or broken, and the car itself looked different from the ones I'd seen at the gas stations, older, more decrepit, with visible damage to the bodywork. But the driver was the same. Even at a distance, even in the darkness, I could see that pale figure behind the wheel. Hands positioned with mechanical precision, face turned toward the road ahead with unwavering focus. I tried everything I could think of to lose it. I took random exits, doubled back on service roads, even pulled into a rest area and waited for 20 minutes with my engine off. But no matter what I did, the car reappeared. Sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, sometimes pulling up alongside on empty stretches of highway where I could see that terrible pale face in perfect detail. The worst part was the sounds. They started sometime around 3 a.m. when I was passing through the outskirts of Odessa. At first, I thought it was just my radio picking up interference, a low, rhythmic scratching like fingernails on metal. But when I turned the radio off, the sound continued. It was coming from outside the truck, from somewhere close, but indefinable. Scritch, 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 like something crawling across the roof of my cab, or clinging to the side, or... I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the shoulder so hard my trailer jackknifed slightly. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out, my heart pounding, expecting to find something, anything, that would explain the sounds. Nothing. The truck was empty, except for my cargo. No damage to the paint, no scratches on the metal, no sign that anything had been in contact with the vehicle. But as I stood there on the empty highway, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up, tapping from inside my cab. Tap, 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 slow, deliberate, like knuckles rapping against glass. It was coming from the passenger side window, the window that faced away from where I was standing, the window I couldn't see from my current position. I walked around the front of the truck, flashlight raised, ready to confront whatever was making the sound. The passenger side was empty, the window unbroken, the door still locked. But there, on the glass, were marks that definitely hadn't been there before. Handprints, or something like handprints. The general shape was right, but the proportions were wrong. Fingers too long, palm too narrow, thumb positioned at an angle that would be anatomically impossible for a human hand. And they were on the inside of the glass. I climbed back into the cab, my movements sharp and jerky with adrenaline and terror. The handprints were clearly visible from the inside too, but they looked different from this angle. Less like prints and more like impressions, as if something with hands that weren't quite human had pressed against the glass from within the cab itself. But that was impossible. I'd been in the truck the entire time. I would have seen anything that got inside. I would have felt it, heard it, something, unless I forced myself to think rationally. Condensation, changes in temperature and humidity, could cause strange effects on glass, especially in the desert, where the temperature differential between day and night was so extreme. What I was seeing could be explained by perfectly normal atmospheric phenomena, except the marks were too clear, too deliberate, and they were exactly the right size and shape to match the pale hands I'd seen gripping the steering wheel of that old sedan. I drove the rest of the night in a state of barely controlled panic, jumping at every sound, checking my mirrors obsessively, trying to ignore the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with reality itself. The old car appeared and disappeared at random intervals, sometimes following, sometimes leading, sometimes just sitting motionless on the shoulder as I passed. And each time I saw it, the figure behind the wheel looked a little more aware, a little more focused on me, specifically rather than the road ahead. Those colorless eyes tracking my movement with predatory precision. Dawn found me outside El Paso, exhausted and shaken. Pulling into the largest truck stop I could find, I parked in the center of the lot, surrounded by other vehicles, under the brightest lights available. The morning sun was already burning off the coolness of night, and the desert heat was beginning to build toward another scorching day. I sat in my cab for nearly an hour, just watching. Normal people going about normal business. Truckers checking their loads. Families heading home from vacations. Commuters starting their daily routines. Everything exactly as it should be in a rational world governed by comprehensible rules. No sign of the old sedan, no pale figures with impossible smiles, no sounds that shouldn't exist. By the time I'd eaten breakfast and showered, I was almost convinced that the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate hallucination, stress, fatigue, maybe a minor stroke or neurological episode that had caused my brain to malfunction temporarily. These things happen to drivers who push too hard for too long. I called my dispatcher, reported my location, and estimated arrival time in Phoenix. Everything normal, everything by the book. Just another day on the road. But as I was walking back to my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, parked 3 spaces away from my rig, was a car that looked exactly like the sedan I'd been seeing all night. Same make, same model, same general condition. But this one was white instead of the various colors I'd observed, and the windows weren't tinted. And there was someone sitting behind the wheel. It was a woman this time, middle-aged, with dark hair and a concerned expression. She was looking at something in her hands, probably a phone or GPS device, and appeared to be completely normal, human, real. I approached cautiously, ready to bolt at the first sign of anything unusual. But as I got closer, she looked up and smiled, a perfectly normal, friendly smile. "Excuse me," she said through her open windows. "I'm a little lost. Do you know the best way to get to Highway 10 from here?" Her voice was normal. Her face was normal. Her eyes were brown and warm and completely human. I gave her directions, and she thanked me genuinely before driving away like any ordinary person would. Standing there in the parking lot, watching her car disappear into traffic, I felt like an idiot. Of course, there were other cars of the same make and model on the road. Of course, there were normal people driving them. My brain had taken a perfectly ordinary situation and twisted it into something horrifying because I was exhausted and stressed and probably suffering from some kind of breakdown. I climbed back into my truck, feeling lighter than I had in hours. The mystery was solved. The nightmare was over. All I had to do was finish my run to Phoenix, deliver my cargo, and then take some time off. Maybe see a doctor about the stress and fatigue, get my head straight before getting back on the road. Phoenix was only a few hours away. I could make it easily, drop my load, and be sleeping in a real bed by evening. The thought of air conditioning and room service and cable TV was almost enough to make me smile. I was pulling out of the truck stop when I saw him. He was standing beside the road just outside the parking lot exit, wearing the same dark suit I'd seen in the car. Up close, in broad daylight, he looked even more wrong than he had in the darkness. His skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, like thin wax stretched over something that wasn't quite the right shape. His hair was perfectly combed, but had the brittle, artificial look of a wig that had been sitting in a shop window for decades. And his smile. His mouth was stretched wide, revealing those impossible rows of teeth, but in the daylight I could see that there was something behind them. Not a throat, not the normal anatomy of a human mouth, but something that moved with a life of its own. Something dark and fluid that writhed like it was trying to escape. He raised one hand, those long, wrong fingers, and pointed directly at me. Then he opened his mouth even wider and spoke a single word that I heard clear as day, despite the fact that I was inside a closed cab with the engine running. Soon, I floored the accelerator, tires screeching as I pulled onto the highway. In my mirrors, I could see him standing motionless beside the road, that terrible smile fixed on his pale face, watching me flee with those colorless eyes. The rest of the drive to Phoenix passed in a blur of terror and paranoia. I kept expecting to see the old sedan appear behind me, or beside me, or somehow ahead of me, despite the laws of physics. But the highway remained normal, busy with regular traffic, populated by ordinary people going about their lives. I delivered my cargo without incident, checked into a motel, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the figure beside the road heat mirage, hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, anything but the alternative. But that night, lying in bed with the air conditioner running and CNN playing softly on the television, I heard the sound that had been haunting me for 24 hours. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window, slow, deliberate, like fingernails against glass. I lay perfectly still, hardly breathing, hoping it would stop, hoping I was dreaming. The tapping continued, patient, persistent, rhythmic, like someone who had all the time in the world and was willing to wait as long as necessary. Finally, I worked up the courage to look. The motel room window faced the parking lot, and the view was illuminated by tall sodium lights that cast everything in a harsh orange glow. I could see my truck parked 3 spaces away, along with a handful of other vehicles belonging to overnight guests. And there, parked directly in front of my window, was the sedan. It looked different again. This time, a deep burgundy color that seemed to absorb the orange light rather than reflect it. But the figure behind the wheel was unmistakable. Same position, same posture, same pale face, staring straight ahead. Except this time, he wasn't alone. There were other figures in the car. In the passenger seat, in the back, pressed against the windows like they were trying to get out. I could see their faces dimly through the glass, pale, distorted, wearing expressions of desperate hunger. Their mouths were open, revealing the same impossible arrays of chaotic teeth. And they were all looking at me. The tapping intensified, coming from multiple points now, not just the window, but the door, the walls, the ceiling, like dozens of hands with too many joints, all trying to find a way inside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but when the operator answered, I realized I had no idea what to say. That monsters were tapping on my window, that impossible cars were following me across 3 states. That reality itself seemed to be breaking down around me. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone outside my room. They're trying to get in. Sir, what's your location? I gave her the address of the motel, my voice shaking. Through the window, I could see the figures in the car becoming more agitated, pressing harder against the glass, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams or demands. "Sir, I'm dispatching an officer to your location." "Are you in immediate danger? Are the suspects armed?" I wanted to laugh. Armed? How do you explain that the weapons they carried were built into their faces, that their very existence was a threat to sanity itself? "Just please hurry." The police arrived 20 minutes later. I watched from my window as 2 officers walked through the parking lot, flashlights cutting through the darkness, checking vehicles and looking for signs of disturbance. They spent several minutes examining the area directly in front of my room, where the sedan had been parked. But there was no car there now, just empty asphalt and the orange glow of the sodium lights. One of the officers knocked on my door. He was young, professional, with a kind of patient expression that suggested he'd dealt with a lot of panicked tourists and stressed-out travelers. "Sir, I'm Officer Rodriguez. You called about someone trying to break into your room?" "There was a car," I said, knowing how it sounded, "parked right outside my window, multiple occupants, acting aggressively." He looked past me at the window, then back at my face. "Sir, have you been drinking tonight or taking any medication?" I'm a commercial driver. I don't drink, and I haven't taken anything stronger than aspirin." "When did you last sleep? Sometimes fatigue can cause—" "I know what I saw." He nodded diplomatically. "I'm sure you did, but there's no car here now, and we didn't find any evidence of anyone trying to break in. No footprints, no damage to the building, nothing on the security cameras." "Security cameras?" "The motel has cameras covering the parking lot. We checked the footage from the last 2 hours. Nothing unusual, just regular guests coming and going." After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the window. Either I was losing my mind or something was happening that existed outside the normal rules of reality. Something that could appear and disappear at will. Something that didn't show up on security cameras or leave physical evidence. Something that was specifically focused on me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale faces pressed against the car windows, those impossible mouths full of chaotic teeth, and every few hours the tapping would start again. Soft, patient, persistent. Always from outside the window, always from a spot where no one should be able to reach. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going home, back to Michigan, back to familiar roads and places where the world made sense. I'd take a leave of absence, see a psychiatrist, get whatever help I needed, but I wasn't spending another night on the road. Not when every mile might bring me closer to something that defied explanation. I loaded up my personal belongings and started the long drive north. It was nearly 1,800 miles from Phoenix to Detroit, but I planned to take my time, stop frequently, stick to major highways with plenty of traffic and witnesses. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. Interstate 17, north through Arizona, was busy with regular traffic, and the desert landscape was beautiful in the morning light. I passed through Flagstaff without incident, stopped for lunch in Winslow, made good time toward the New Mexico border. But somewhere outside Gallup, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my blood turn to ice. A car was following me. Not the same sedan I'd been seeing. This one was newer, a late model gray sedan, that looked like it had just rolled off a rental lot. But the driver, even at a distance, even through the distortion of multiple mirrors, I could see that pale face, those colorless eyes, that too wide mouth. He was wearing different clothes, a modern business suit instead of the vintage jacket, but it was unmistakably the same entity that had been stalking me. And this time, he was in my lane, gaining ground rapidly. I floored the accelerator, but the rental car kept pace effortlessly. Within minutes, it was right behind me, so close I could see every detail of that horrible face in my mirrors. The mouth was open again, revealing the chaos behind those false teeth, and I could swear I heard something even over the sound of my engine and the wind. "Get in." The voice was coming from inside my cab again, bypassing my ears entirely and speaking directly into my brain. It was patient, almost gentle, like someone offering a reasonable suggestion. "Get in. Stop running. Get in." I swerved into the passing lane, but the gray sedan matched my movement perfectly. I tried to brake suddenly, hoping it would overshoot, but it decelerated at exactly the same rate. No matter what I did, it stayed exactly where it was, close enough to touch, close enough for me to see every impossible detail of its occupant. And then, somehow, it was beside me. I don't know how it happened. One moment it was behind me, the next it was in the adjacent lane, keeping perfect pace with my truck. The pale figure behind the wheel turned his head toward me with mechanical precision, and for the first time, I saw him smile. It wasn't the wide, tooth-filled grin I'd witnessed before. This was smaller, more subtle, almost human. But somehow, it was infinitely more terrifying. It was the smile of something that had been patient for a very long time and was finally getting what it wanted. He raised one hand, those long, jointed fingers, and pointed at the passenger seat of his car. The message was clear. "Get in." I yanked the wheel hard to the right, taking the next exit at dangerous speed. Behind me, I heard the squeal of brakes and the honking of horns as other drivers reacted to my sudden maneuver. But in my mirrors, I could see the gray sedan following, taking the same exit with supernatural smoothness. The exit led to a small town, one of those places that existed purely to serve travelers on the interstate gas stations, fast food restaurants, a couple of motels all clustered around the highway, interchanged like pilot fish around a shark. I pulled into the parking lot of a McDonald's, hoping that crowds and public visibility would provide some protection. The lot was full of families, tourists, regular people going about their normal lives. Surely whatever was following me wouldn't risk exposure in such a public place. But as I climbed out of my truck, I saw the gray sedan pull into a space 3 rows away. The pale figure behind the wheel sat motionless for a moment, then opened his door and stepped out, standing upright. He was taller than I'd expected, maybe 6.5 feet, with a kind of build that suggested he'd once been human, but had been stretched somehow, made longer and thinner than anatomy should allow. His movements were precise but wrong, like a marionette being operated by someone who'd never seen a real person walk. He began moving toward me with steady, measured steps. People walked past him, families with children, teenagers, elderly couples, but none of them seemed to see him. They moved around him unconsciously, as if he was just another obstacle in their path, but their eyes never focused on him directly. I backed toward the restaurant entrance, hoping to find safety in the crowd, but even inside, surrounded by dozens of people, I could feel his approach. Through the windows, I could see him walking across the parking lot with that same mechanical gait, getting closer with each passing second. "Sir, are you all right?" I turned to find a manager looking at me with concern, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "There's someone outside," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who's been following me. There's something wrong with him." She looked through the window, scanning the parking lot. "I don't see anyone unusual. Are you sure you're feeling okay? You look like you might be having some kind of medical episode." I looked again. The pale figure was standing directly outside the restaurant entrance, maybe 10 feet away, staring through the glass with those colorless eyes. His mouth was opening slowly, revealing the impossible chaos behind his teeth, but she couldn't see him. Just like the police officers, just like the people in the parking lot, she was looking right through him as if he didn't exist. "Please," I said, grabbing her arm. "Call the police. Tell them there's a disturbance in the parking lot." She looked at me with growing alarm, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. But she nodded and reached for the phone behind the counter. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I pushed through the crowd and out the back exit, running across the parking lot toward my truck. Behind me, I could hear the manager talking to the police dispatcher, describing a customer who seemed to be experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. But I could also hear something else. Footsteps. Steady, measured, keeping pace, no matter how fast I ran. I reached my truck and climbed into the cab, locking the doors and starting the engine in one fluid motion. In my mirrors, I could see the pale figure standing in the middle of the parking lot, watching me with that terrible smile. And then he was gone. Not walking away, not getting into a car, not moving to a different location, just gone, like he'd never been there at all. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes, engine idling, waiting for him to reappear. When he didn't, I carefully drove back onto the interstate and continued north. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was happening, wherever he'd gone, he'd be back. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. I stopped only when absolutely necessary, for fuel, for food, for the mandatory rest breaks required by DOT regulations. Each time, I scanned every car in every parking lot, looking for that pale face, those colorless eyes, that impossible smile. Sometimes I saw him different cars, different locations, but always the same figure behind the wheel, always motionless, always watching, always waiting. And each time he seemed a little more real, a little more present in the world. By the time I reached Michigan, I was barely functional. 3 days of terror and sleep deprivation had left me shaking, paranoid, jumping at shadows. I drove straight to my apartment in Detroit, parked in the underground garage, and locked myself inside. For a week, I didn't leave. I called in sick to work, ordered groceries online, stayed away from windows. I told myself I was recovering from a breakdown. That time and rest would restore my sanity and make the memories fade. But late at night, when the building was quiet and the city sounds were muted by concrete and steel, I could hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Always patient, always persistent. Something with too many joints tapping against my window, 20 stories above the street. After 2 weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if what I'd experienced was real or if I was genuinely losing my mind. I drove back to that first truck stop in Texas, the Lone Star Travel Plaza, where it had all started. It looked exactly the same. Neon signs buzzing in the desert heat, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across empty asphalt. But the old sedan was gone, replaced by a different car in the same spot. A late model Honda Civic, white paint gleaming under the lights. And behind the wheel, a young man, maybe 25, with sandy hair and a confused expression. His hands were positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and he was staring straight ahead with the same fixed intensity I'd seen in that pale face weeks earlier. But this driver was clearly human, clearly alive. He looked tired, maybe a little lost, but absolutely normal in every way. I approached the car cautiously, ready to run at the first sign of anything unusual, but when I tapped on the window, he rolled it down and looked at me with genuine relief. "Oh, thank God," he said. "I've been sitting here for hours and I can't remember where I'm supposed to go. I know I was driving somewhere important, but every time I try to start the car, I forget why I'm here." His eyes were brown and warm and completely human, but there was something in his expression, something in the way he held himself, that reminded me of the pale figure I'd been seeing. "What's your name?" I asked. "Mike," he said without hesitation. "Mike Patterson. I'm a truck driver, or I was, I think. Everything's kind of fuzzy right now." The name hit me like a physical blow. Mike Patterson. My name. But I was Mike Patterson. I was standing right there talking to him, very much alive and present. "What year is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. "I'm not sure. 2023? 2024? Time feels different here." I backed away from the car, my heart pounding. In the convenience store window, I could see the same kid behind the counter, earbuds in, nodding along to his music. Everything was exactly as it had been weeks ago, as if no time had passed at all. And in the driver's seat of the Honda, Mike Patterson, or something wearing his face, continued to stare straight ahead with growing confusion, his hands positioned precisely on the steering wheel, waiting for instructions that would never come. I drove away without looking back. But in my rearview mirror, I could see him watching me leave, his expression shifting slowly from confusion to something that might have been understanding. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to return to my normal life, tried to pretend that what happened was just an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. Sometimes I almost succeed. But late at night, when I'm driving empty highways and the road stretches endlessly ahead, I sometimes see a familiar car in my mirrors. Different make, different model, different color, but always with the same motionless figure behind the wheel. And I know that somewhere out there, at truck stops and gas stations across the country, other drivers are stopping for fuel and rest. They're seeing cars with motionless figures inside, dismissing them as harmless vagrants or sleeping travelers. They don't realize they're looking at themselves, at what they'll become when the thing behind those pale eyes decides it's time to switch vehicles, time to find a new form to wear while it hunts for the next victim. The pale man isn't gone. He's just wearing a different face now, sitting in a different car, waiting with infinite patience for the next person to get too close, to look too carefully, to see too much. And when they do, when they make that fatal connection, they'll join the collection. Another face for him to wear, another identity to assume, another car to drive through the endless night. If you're reading this, if you're a driver who travels the lonely highways after dark, remember this story. And if you ever see a car parked at a truck stop with someone sitting motionless behind the wheel, hands positioned perfectly on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead into nothing, don't look too closely. Don't try to help. Don't make eye contact. Just drive away as fast as you can and pray that when you check your mirrors, the car stays exactly where it is. Because if it starts following you, if that pale face turns in your direction and those colorless eyes find yours, then you'll discover what I learned that night in the Texas desert. Some things that look human aren't human at all. And once they've seen you, really seen you, they'll never let you go. They'll just wait with infinite patience until it's your turn to sit behind the wheel with your hands positioned perfectly at 10 and 2, staring straight ahead into the darkness, waiting for the next curious traveler to get close enough to see your face. And when they do, you'll smile that impossible smile and open your mouth to reveal the chaos behind your teeth. And you'll speak the only words you remember. Get in.